fact, you may have heard the leading think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, accusing smaller parties, including the Greens, of using their proposals. You outlined some of them in terms of the funding for the NHS that you would support in higher taxes across the board. But Paul Johnson, who is the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, said that your proposals are poisoning the political debate. Let's have a listen.
I want to spend a little time, though, on Reform UK and the Greens. They offer much bigger numbers, very exciting radical policies. Of course, they're not going to be implemented because they're not going to form government. But I would suggest that the way that they suggest that their radical reforms can realistically make a positive difference, when in fact what they propose is wholly unattainable, does help to actually to poison the political debate.
Well, that's quite an accusation. Do you agree, first of all, that your proposals are wholly unattainable?
I mean, you might as well have played the bit where he actually talked the real criticism. Because all this is essentially, far right and far left are all the same with stupid ideas that don't make sense, right? Actually, how about we listen to what Paul Johnson had to say, what his actual structural critique was with the plans? That might give us more of an idea of what's wrong with them rather than just, can't trust a small party.
No, I don't, surprisingly. I also think it's absurd to put Reform and Greens in the same place. Reform's anti-migrant, anti-net zero, and Greens are the opposite of all.
Let's focus on what you are proposing, because he was very specific, proposes an extra, in the rest of his speech, an extra £145 billion in day-to-day spending compared to £5 billion for Labour, £17 billion on tax cuts from the Conservatives. It is wholly unattainable.
Well, actually, BBC Verify said that our economic manifesto is economically credible, and also we've worked with the Wealth Tax Commission and University of Greenwich on their modelling. But more widely, I think, if you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility, a few years ago they did a report around the climate crisis, and actually a lot of the solutions they were suggesting around the taxation we're asking for, and crucially the borrowing, is very similar to our plans. Ultimately, this is about what is the level of ambition, and if you borrow to pay for unfunded tax cuts like Liz Truss did, that will crash the economy. But if you borrow for capital investment to get our country moving and ultimately invest in the future of tackling the climate crisis and getting an economy moving, then that's exactly the right way to go. That's real hope and real change, and that's what the Green Party is offering.
I've got to say...
And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. The reason why it's different, I think it's worth pointing out the mechanics of why these things are different, especially in the UK's economy. Well, we're not an investment economy, we're a rentier economy, an asset economy. Which woolly phrases, but I think it gets the picture across. When Liz Truss had her predictions about what her tax cuts would do, she was going for growth by saying, well, look, people can't spend enough money in our economy. If we give them tax cuts, they'll spend that. It will generate economic activity. It'll grow the economy. Laffer curve will mean that we'll end up not necessarily losing as much tax as we thought we would, and the growth will help stimulate there to be more commodities being bought and sold, which is going to be better in the long run. That's not going to happen if you give rich people tax cuts in the UK. There isn't much to be gained from them risking their newfound capital to invest that in, say, for example, new startup businesses to be able to create more commodities be bought and sold. What it would probably do, most likely would do, is they would use that extra liquidity or that extra capital, they would pour it into the asset economy that already exists because it's a guaranteed return, especially with something like property or financial instruments, which the government already tries to protect them, maintain the value of, and to see them increase overall, because important people, i.e. people who donate to political parties and middle-class swing voters, and pension funds, who are also swing voters as well, the people who have their money invested in pension funds, need financial instruments to increase in value, because that reflects the value of their pension, and needs their property to go up in value. So governments will always run policy that protects these interests. So it's much more a guaranteed return of new capital that's in the hands of rich people, which is what Liz Truss did, tax cuts for the rich, that they're just going to put that liquidity into existing asset prices, make it more expensive to increase their overall net worth. It wasn't going to create more economic activity. That was the big failure of the Liz Truss paradigm on why they would get growth. If you borrow for capital investment, you are taking that money that you can maybe think that they might capital invest in the private sector, which obviously I would argue wouldn't happen. We don't know because Liz Truss had no projections, no nothing, no oversight from the Office of Budget Responsibility, for example, which is why the markets got spooked. There was no plan as to the kind of growth they thought they were going to be able to get to pay for the tax cuts and pay for the extra borrowing, which was what the tax cuts were coming from. They were increasing fiscal expansion to be able to cut those taxes. That's why the markets fell out of favour. Yet if you can guarantee this extra money is going into investment, it is going into increasing on the supply side, which is what capital investment is. Right, if you invest in new green technology, that's new jobs, that's new supply, that will also bring down the supply-demand curve with that increased supply. which means that it might probably unlikely to be inflationary, and will also generate value for the state. The state gains assets, which counteracts the liabilities that you get from increasing that debt, which is going to net overall, as long as you're appreciating in value more than the interest you pay on that debt. That means that gives the markets confidence in what you're doing with the money that you're borrowing. This is the difference between investing money in capital investment and using borrowing for tax cuts.
What Paul Johnson there says, to me, is the worst of kind of policing the Overton window. If anything poisons the political debate, it's kind of pouring scorn on smaller parties who are actually having some interesting ideas. Now, I'm not going to say that the Green Party manifesto stacks up economically, nor reform, but at least there's some interest there. And frankly, in this very kind of uninteresting general election, some of the ideas that are actually worth paying attention to are coming from reform and from the Greens. And I think that makes it a more healthy debate. So for him to stand there and basically insist on orthodoxy, which is what his role seems to be, we've tried that for decades. It hasn't worked.
Right. Steve, is it poisoning the...
Yeah, I agreed with the unheard guy there, and he is right. Again, my criticisms of Reform UK have never ever been, I think they're going to crash the economy with their balmy plans for tax cuts or whatever. What I have done is say the vision that this promotes is one of inequality and is one of reducing the power of workers within the economy, creating a Singapore-on-Thames style, whatever. Like, that's been my criticism. I think it's bad for workers and bad for the poor, not that it is fiscally not credible. With most of these manifestos, which are of parties that are unlikely to get into government, it's mood music about their priorities, rather than a plan for what they're going to do, because they're not going to get into government. It's right that they can be more bold when they have no realistic prospect of having to put these things into action, and I think that's true as a criticism. But the idea that, well, the problem with the Green Party's plan is they say they're going to invest all this money from taxation into the NHS to day-to-day spending, for example. But if they spend all this money and they don't get the taxation money, that's going to crash the economy. I think, well, what's more likely to happen is that if they don't get the extra tax revenue that they predict that they will from their capital gains changes, from their national insurance changes, from their wealth tax, all that will lead into is less investment in the NHS in retrospect, rather than this gigantic economic crash that all of these centre-right neoliberal technocrats scaremongering that would actually happen. But what you need to know is what these people's priorities are when it comes to a manifesto of a party that's not likely to get into government. And that's fine for both Reform and the Greens. Again, I think Reform is bad because I think that their vision is bad. I think their values are bad. I think the plans that they have in ideological terms are ones that I think would be worse for people I care about. Not that I think that they are fiscally not credible, because you can't make those claims about somebody who doesn't have any realistic plan to get into government.
For the Greens, unlike Reform, which has definitely increased in terms of people's voting intentions, yours has been pretty static at 6%. Why?
Yes, so we've quadrupled our number of local councils in the last 4 years, but in a general election, the first past the post system is undoubtedly more difficult for us. However, we target
But the support's
seats.
gone up for Reform, it's stayed the same for Greens.
Well, we target seats like Bristol, Brighton, North Herefordshire and Waveney Valley. This is places where we think we can get Green MPs. It's really clear that the Conservatives are toast. We will have a Labour government, but having Green MPs there will push that Labour government to be bigger, better and bolder. For instance, tomorrow, Carla Denyer, the co-leader of the Greens, will be out with the junior doctors on strike on the picket line. Ellie, will you join them?
Well, I wouldn't promote that, Zach. That's
Well,
not
I think
that's
it's
not a
important
good
that
thing.
people get pay
That's not a good
restoration.
thing.
And I think
Well,
most
let's just
people would
remind people
stand
what
with
that is. 35% pay restoration. And you'd fund that how?
See, they keep saying, oh, it's 35% pay restoration. Yeah, it's £15 up to £21 an hour. I think that it should be fine that junior doctors get paid more than people who work in Pret-a-Manger in central London. I think that's a reasonable salary. As much as I think the people in Pret-a-Manger should be able to organise and earn as much as possible, they should do that, 100%. But I don't think it's unreasonable, even from a leftist perspective, to say that maybe we should be paying junior doctors more than people who work in Pret-a-Manger. I mean, ideally, we should replace Pret-a-Manger with the Pound Bakery, nod to Zack Polanski on Cross Question, and then we can force posh London middle-class people to eat some sausage rolls and some pasties rather than whatever the fuck Pret makes. It's crazy expensive. But anyway, I think that we need to ensure that there is a competitive market for junior doctors' salaries, internationally at the very least, as I mentioned earlier on. Interesting as well, as they say, oh, well, Reform UK's vote share has increased, but the Greens hasn't. It's because people on the liberal and left side of politics, at least as far as the Overton window is concerned, are very tactically voting pilled, right? Whereas actually, if you ask people who they would vote for if there was an equal chance of parties winning, Green Party are third on 19%. They drop 13 percentage points. According to this singular poll, of course, all of the caveats, they drop 13 percentage points just out of people not thinking that they can win because they're a small party, which is an artifact of first past the post. Whereas Reform UK voters are so incensed with rage at the Conservative Party, they don't care if Keir Starmer wins. I wonder why they aren't scared of a Keir Starmer premiership. Very weird, that, isn't it? So much so that they're happy to just vote Reform regardless, because they couldn't care less about whether the Tories win or not. Whereas we do. We really do care about who wins on the left and liberal and even the kind of centre ground of politics now. They just want the Tories out and will vote tactically to do so, and that really hurts small parties like the Greens. It's not that they're not popular, because we've seen the stats to show they are popular. They just have a voting base that is more tactically voting pilled than the right wings are. And on top of that, as Edward points out in chat too, there's a reason why Reform UK have a massive presence and the Greens don't, even though the Greens have way more councillors, like factors of 10 more councillors. That's because Farage and Richard Tice get paid megabucks by GB News and Talk TV to have their little promotional shows for Reform UK. Like, how many Green Party MPs or prospective MPs or members or councillors have got their own show on GB News called Richard Tice's Sunday Sermon? Yeah, they don't have any, do they? I wonder why. It's almost like that Reform UK have interests that align with those who own media companies, and the Green Party doesn't. Just a thought.
So this is going to be both from borrowing and also from the taxes I was talking about, making sure those with the broadest shoulders.
Borrowing and taxes. Steve's got his head in his hands. Ellie, what about you?
I mean, I've looked at the last page of the Green Party manifesto where it sets out costings, and I think that under that, it's something like £82 billion worth of additional debt.
It's not far off what Jeremy Corbyn's Labour manifesto would have cost in 2019.
But also it's a lot less than Austria and France.
In that Liz Truss mini budget that crashed the economy, sent people's mortgages spiralling, I think there was something like 40 billion of additional debt. So, there's these proposals, over 80 billion additional debt would just absolutely crash our economy.
Borrowing for tax cuts is not the same as borrowing for capital investment. I have already explained this. But of course, in Labour world, we don't care about the narrative that's being spun. The Labour Party couldn't give a shit if they ferment neoliberal rhetorical consensus in the minds of the voting public. They just want to fight off the attacks from the left. And so they will happily say, we can never spend any money, the economy would crash. Borrowing for tax cuts is the same as borrowing for capital investment. We will shrink the Overton window as small as possible so that we maintain power forever whilst never changing the voting system. Please do not threaten our political hegemony. I hate these people. Again, somebody in my Twitter replies, describe the Labour Party as being the biggest barrier to progressive change, and they are 100% correct. And also, as Morinaka points out, we literally have decades of underinvestment. Like, this is the bare minimum to bring us back to where investment should have been had we not had a Conservative government doing fiscal contraction during a liquidity.
But your health spokesman, Wes Streeting, has said to the BMA, as regards junior doctor strikes, that he'll be on the phone on day one, is what he said. What do you think they will receive that as a message? Of course they're expecting a big pay rise. As soon as, finally, after 14 years, they're going to get a Labour government.
Should they get one?
Wes has also said that he doesn't think these strikes should go ahead. He doesn't think that the current government is going to resolve it. And yes, one of the first calls that he would make on the 5th of July is if we are lucky enough to form a government,
he's going to talk about
and get around the table, because that's how you
not get round the table. Let's leave that. Let's just assume they're all round the table. What's the figure going?
It feels like they're all a step away from saying there is no magic money tree at all times. Well, literally, we had Super Tansky on Twitter. Super Tansky saying, well, we can't borrow now. The economy is in a mess. Let's sort out the economy and then we can spend some money. I'm like, no, sorting out the economy requires capital investment. You are literally repeating the lines of David Cameron and George Osborne by saying, well, we need to fix the roof while the sun is shining. Like, we need to fix the roof while the sun is shining. Like, this is literally what David Cameron and George Osborne said in the austerity period that destroyed this country. They've been so brain poisoned by the neoliberal consensus being trotted out by Labour Party apparatchiks, repeating it verbatim with no critical analysis of what any of these things actually mean, to the point at which they just turn themselves into Cameron-era Conservatives without even knowing that they've done it. because they don't have any critical thinking skills to be able to critically appraise what the Labour Party is telling them. They just hear the talking points handed down by Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves, Bridget Phillipson, Shabana Mahmood, Pat McFadden, Steve Reed, all of the Labour together fucking gang of four, and they repeat it verbatim without even thinking about what they're saying. And it's like, yeah, we're just Cameronite Tories now. Incredible scenes from these people. Again, a basic level of economic literacy, of macroeconomic literacy, about basic tenets of Keynesian economics would make them know that the Labour Party was completely full of shit, or were just lying openly to the public about how macroeconomics works. But they never bothered studying it. They just think, oh, well, the red team is saying it, well, it must be correct. And then they repeat it verbatim, and it becomes political consensus. It becomes part of the political zeitgeist forever. It's insane. All of these like Labour, Liberal, red team sycophants just becoming Cameronite Tories by absorbing Labour rhetoric and repeating it without any critical analysis of what's being said. Infuriating. Then again, that's how stupid you have to be a Labour Party apparatchik.
Going to be.
Yeah,
You've got to talk about money.
You know that I'm not going to carry out negotiations on TV, but getting round the table, having those conversations.
Yeah, but Zack, you're a pressure group in that sense, aren't you? You're a pressure group on this issue, aren't you? You're just going to try and pressurise if Labour wins the election.
Greens in Parliament, and in fact, Ellie could go and join those junior doctors on the picket line, but is refusing that.
Right.
But I think the important point here is the pandemic. We saw multimillionaires and billionaires get richer than they ever have, whilst our junior doctors and people in the NHS were out there working every single day.
Well,
of course they should be paid properly. I mean, the fact we're even having this conversation is that orthodoxy. A proper wage compared to...
define proper wage.
By taxing multimillionaires and billionaires to make sure that those people running a...
And again, just a wage that means they won't leave and go to Australia, or if they're like nurses who went to go and work in Tesco because it was more lucrative for them to do so, right? That's just basic stuff. It's basic stuff. That's pay restoration. Again, the 35% is not a pay rise, it is pay restoration to the same real terms pay they had in 2010 before the austerity period. That's what real pay means. That's what a proper pay rise means. That is the context that this strike is happening in. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just say it. Say you don't think doctors deserve £20 an hour. Say it. Say it to my face. I really wish Zack would talk about the claps. Like, we don't need to give these people pay restoration for all the hard work they did during the pandemic. We paid them in claps. Claps now legal tender, chat. That's what it is, basically. We clapped you. You're not happy? Are you not entertained?
Country are paid properly, and when you say that's ridiculous, you put your head in your hands. 14 years of conservative austerity.
The reason my head is in my hands is because they want 35%. The government have said that's unaffordable, where Streeting has rightly said that is unaffordable. The government have offered
Isn't it only like 1.3 billion as well? Again, it's smaller than the amount of money they've spent stopping the strikes. Not all of the NHS budget is spent on junior doctors' salaries. You could easily just implement the capital gains tax changes that the Greens want you to be able to pay for the two-child benefit cap and the junior doctors' pay disputes, whilst also having a bunch of money left over to do something else with as well. Like, it'd be absolutely fine to do that.
The government have
had a pay cut over those.
The government have offered 9% plus 3%, so that's 12%. So somewhere between 12 and 35.
Yeah, so they're still not even at £18 an hour on your pay rise. They're still below £18 an hour and still lower in real terms pay than what they had in 2010. That's why it's pay restoration.
Is where the deal lies, right? So if you're picking up the phone on day one, what's your gambit? Where do you start from? Because it's somewhere between 12 and 35. Anything over 12 costs more than is currently in the
But the Conservatives have obviously failed completely to resolve these strikes.
Yep, and I don't think that the BMA Junior Doctors Committee has any intention of settling with a Conservative government. They have settled with an SNP government and a Labour government in Wales.
At least we're getting a policy. He says wants to raise taxes and pay them a lot more.
But hang on,
coherent.
to what? Right.
So neither of these parties, and particularly the Labour Party, which we're expecting to lead, are admitting, what are you going to do? There's nothing in the manifesto to pay doctors more. You're saying you're not going to borrow more. You're not going to raise taxes. How are you going to do it?
Right. Can I just come... Yeah, well, how are you going to do it?
But last time Labour were in government, we didn't see the strikes like we've seen at the moment.
Yeah, but you are going to have to resolve this one.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm confident that Wes Streeting will be able to do that if we're privileged.
Literally, when they were asked about the strike action in like the meeting with the NHS students, they couldn't even say pay. Oh, well, the first thing we need is respect. They keep saying this line, oh, well, the first thing doctors need is respect. No, they need money. And it's not just they need money because they want to get money because they're greedy or whatever, whatever. You can impugn the motives of them wanting to get paid more as much as you want. I'm not going to get into that conversation. But in terms of the future of the NHS, the recruitment and retention crisis in our staffing sector in the NHS is broadly around pay. Because this is how markets work. if somebody can get offered better pay elsewhere, whether it's in a different sector or in the same sector in another country, they'll just go. They'll just go, right? The market is telling you are not paying these people enough. You'd have thought the neoliberal, people who currently staff the halls of the uni party of the Tories and Labour at the moment would understand how market dynamics work. This is the future of the NHS is at stake, which is why we should have resolved these things ages ago. That's the real problem here. And that will require not just respect, not just getting around the table, it will require actual cold, hard cash. And again, a capital gains tax rise to pay for a pay rise for doctors, taking away from people accruing value off their share portfolio, contributing literally nothing to society by making money off of investment rather than being productive, and spending that on some of those productive people in our society, the most useful people in our society, the most critical people to having a functioning society, which is doctors. I know it seems like a fair trade-off to me. I don't know about you, chat.
But it's going to cost him money.
Complacency as well about the outcome of this election either.
Right. I mean, you say, Zack, just briefly, the money will be raised by taxing, in particular, the rich. Who do you count as the rich?
So before I was saying assets of over £10 million or more, 1%.
Not your policies in the manifesto.
National insurance. So we're also talking about people earning over £55,000 a year,
right,
giving £5 a week.
That makes you rich.
We have to talk about what that's offset by. That's offset by cheaper public transport, not having to use privatised healthcare, making sure there's a council house available. Ultimately, this isn't just about the tax. It's about
some teachers and police sergeants could pay £300 or more extra in taxes.
When I talk to people, £5 a week, those same people would be very happy to do that if it meant that we had public services that ran properly. There's a sense this country is broken. It's these two parties who have broken it together in this orthodoxy, and the Green Party are offering real hope and real change.
Do you think that...
Yeah, why should people who earn £55,000 a year or more pay a lower percentage of their income in national insurance than people who earn less than them? Why? Why should they do that? That doesn't make any sense at all. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.